The San Andreas Fault is shaking again. Over just a short span of time, reports began circulating that dozens of tiny earthquakes had struck along or near the fault, raising the one question Californians never want to hear out loud. Is a bigger one coming? Now here's the important part, right up front. I could not verify a public USGS source confirming that the San Andreas Fault recorded exactly 73 microquakes in 12 hours as a single official event. What I could verify is that California has been dealing with multiple real earthquake swarms, including a January 2026 sequence near Indio after a magnitude 4.9 event, and that USGS says the chance that any earthquake will be followed by a larger, nearby earthquake within a week is about 5% on average. That means the fear behind this headline is real. But the science is more complicated than the panic. Because on the San Andreas, a burst of tiny quakes does not automatically mean the big one is next. At the same time, it does not mean nothing is happening. And that uneasy middle ground is exactly what makes this story so unsettling. The San Andreas Fault has become more than a fault line. It is a symbol, a line on the map that millions of people know by name, even if they do not know exactly where it runs. It stretches roughly 800 miles through California and marks part of the boundary between the Pacific and North American tectonic plates. When it moves, the world pays attention. And when it doesn't move for a while, people worry even more. That is what makes clusters of tiny earthquakes so powerful in the public imagination. A single microquake is easy to ignore. A few aftershocks seem normal. But dozens of small quakes in a tight window? That sounds different. That sounds like the beginning of something. And once people hear words like swarm, foreshock, or fault activity, their minds jump straight to catastrophe. That reaction is understandable. California lives with the constant knowledge that a large earthquake is not just possible, but inevitable over the long term. USGS long-range estimates cited in late 2025 reporting put the chance of a magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake by 2043 at about 60% in the Los Angeles region and 72% in the San Francisco Bay Area. So when small quakes start stacking up, people do not just see data, they see a warning.
But the truth is more nuanced, and in some ways, more unnerving. Because the real danger is not just that a bigger quake could happen. It is that no one can say exactly when. Why this headline feels so dangerous? There is a reason a headline like this spreads instantly. It combines three things that trigger immediate fear: the San Andreas Fault, a sudden cluster of earthquakes, and the possibility of something bigger. That combination hits a deep psychological nerve. Californians have spent decades hearing about overdue stress, locked sections of the fault, and the eventual arrival of the so-called big one. So when a swarm starts making noise, even a small one, it feels like the ground might be clearing its throat before saying something much louder. But the first thing we need to separate is headline certainty from scientific certainty. I could not find a credible public bulletin from USGS or the Southern California Seismic Network confirming a single official event described exactly as 73 microquakes in 12 hours on the San Andreas Fault. What I did find were multiple verified examples showing that California has experienced real swarms recently, including the January 19th to 20th, 2026 sequence near Indio that followed a magnitude 4.9 earthquake and produced numerous aftershocks. That matters because it changes the framing. This is not a case where the science says, yes, 73 microquakes means a major rupture is imminent. Instead, the science says something much more careful. Small earthquakes happen frequently in California. Swarms happen. Aftershocks happen. And most of the time, they do not become catastrophic main shocks. But most of the time is not the same thing as never. And that gap is where fear lives. What a swarm actually means.
One of the biggest misunderstandings in earthquake coverage is that people treat all sequences of quakes the same way. They are not the same. USGS draws a clear distinction between aftershocks and swarms. Aftershocks follow a larger main shock and generally decrease over time. A swarm, on the other hand, is a sequence of mostly small earthquakes with no single clear main shock, and the biggest quake in a swarm can actually happen later in the sequence rather than at the beginning. That detail alone is enough to make people uneasy, because if a sequence is a swarm, not a simple aftershock series, then the largest event may not have happened yet.
USGS also says swarms often suggest some additional ingredient is involved, such as slow fault slip, the movement of fluids, or, in volcanic areas, magma. In California, swarms are relatively rare overall, but certain places are known for them, including the San Ramon Valley, where similar swarm behavior has occurred many times in the past. That is where the story gets interesting. A swarm does not automatically mean a major quake is coming, but it does mean the fault zone is doing something more complex than a simple one-and-done rupture. And complexity is unsettling, especially on a fault as infamous as the San Andreas. The January 2026 reminder near Indio. If you want to understand why people are so sensitive right now, look at what happened in Southern California earlier this year. On January 19, 2026, a magnitude 4.9 earthquake struck about 20 kilometers north-northeast of Indio at a shallow depth of roughly 3.1 kilometers, according to USGS. That quake was followed by numerous aftershocks and regional concern because it occurred in a seismically important part of Southern California, near the Coachella Valley. News coverage at the time described a continuing sequence of smaller quakes, with local reports noting more than 47 earthquakes recorded in the broader swarm by early the next morning. Another report said USGS assigned about a 5% chance of a slightly larger quake in the following week, while the chance of a magnitude 6 or larger was much lower. That 5% figure is important because it sounds small, but it also sounds big enough to make people nervous. And that is exactly the challenge with earthquake probabilities. Scientifically, 5% is not a prediction. Emotionally, it feels like a threat. That January sequence reminded California that even moderate shaking can quickly spark a bigger conversation about the San Andreas and whether a more damaging event might follow. So when people now hear about 73 microquakes, they are not reacting in a vacuum. They are reacting with fresh memory. The question everyone wants answered. So let's deal directly with the question in the title. Does a cluster of microquakes mean a bigger one is coming? USGS's general answer is no, not in the sense of a reliable warning. The agency says the chance that an earthquake will be followed by a larger nearby earthquake within a week is about 5% on average. It also explains that an earthquake cannot be identified as a foreshock unless a larger earthquake actually happens later. That means scientists cannot look at a cluster of tiny quakes and say with confidence, this is definitely the beginning of a big event. They can only say, this is increased activity. It deserves attention, and statistically, the chance of something larger is higher than 0, but still usually low. That is not the answer the public wants. People want yes or no, safe or danger, normal or warning. But earthquake science often does not work that way. It deals in shifting probabilities, incomplete information, and patterns that only make full sense after the sequence is over. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable part of all. The ground does not give clean explanations while it is moving. Why tiny quakes matter anyway? Just because microquakes usually do not announce a disaster does not mean they are meaningless. Tiny earthquakes matter for several reasons. First, they show where stress is being released, or at least where motion is being recorded. Second, they help scientists map hidden structures and fault behavior in more detail. And third, in some cases, Swarms of tiny quakes reveal things about the subsurface that would otherwise stay invisible. A January 2026 science release on research in Northern California described how swarms of very small earthquakes are helping scientists uncover a hidden and surprisingly complex fault zone where the San Andreas system meets the Cascadia subduction zone. The work involved researchers from USGS, UC Davis, and the University of Colorado Boulder. That is a powerful reminder. Small quakes are not just nothing. They are information. They can reveal where fluids are moving, where faults are interacting, and where the crust is adjusting in ways that may not produce major damage, but still matter greatly for understanding seismic hazard. So, when a burst of tiny quakes appears, experts do pay attention. Not because they think every swarm is a direct precursor to catastrophe, but because the Earth is talking, and even faint signals can matter. The San Andreas problem. The reason all of this becomes emotionally explosive on the San Andreas is simple. This fault already has a reputation no other fault in America can match. It is the one everyone knows, the one in documentaries, the one in disaster films, the one associated with overdue rupture and civilization-level consequences. That reputation is grounded in real hazard. The San Andreas Fault system is capable of producing major earthquakes, and official long-term forecasts continue to put California at substantial risk of large events in coming decades. USGS probabilities cited in 2025 coverage show a 48% chance of a magnitude 7.5 or larger earthquake somewhere in California by 2043, and a 7% chance of a magnitude 8 or larger event. Those are not microquake numbers. Those are civilization-shaking numbers. So when people hear about a burst of activity along or near the San Andreas, it is never just about the tiny quakes themselves. It is about what they represent. They feel like sparks near a powder keg. Not because science confirms that interpretation every time, but because the larger context is already terrifying. Why experts sound so cautious? One thing that often frustrates people is how careful seismologists sound in moments like this. The public wants certainty. Experts give probabilities. The public wants warning. Experts say, "We are monitoring the sequence." The public hears that as hesitation. But caution is not ignorance. It is discipline. USGS explains that foreshock and aftershock labels are relative terms. A quake only becomes a foreshock if a larger quake follows. Swarms may last hours, days, weeks, or longer, and the largest earthquake in a swarm may occur later in the sequence. That means experts are working with a moving target. If they overreact too soon, they create unnecessary panic. If they underreact, people accuse them of missing the signs. So they stay with what the data can support: location, magnitude, frequency, and short-term probability. That can feel unsatisfying, but it is also honest. And in earthquake science, honesty often sounds like uncertainty, because certainty simply is not available in real time. California's recent swarm mood. Part of why this story lands so hard is that California has already been in a swarm-heavy mood. Beyond the January Indio sequence, late 2025 and early 2026 saw notable public concern over swarm behavior in places like the Bay Area and San Ramon Valley. USGS published material in February 2026 explaining that swarms are common in the San Ramon Valley and have happened there repeatedly for decades. Recent media coverage also described residents rattled by what felt like a ceaseless series of smaller quakes. That broader atmosphere matters, because the public is not evaluating each sequence calmly and in isolation. It is layering one cluster on top of another. One Bay Area swarm, one Southern California sequence, one new headline after another. And over time, that creates a kind of seismic anxiety, where even routine, low-magnitude activity begins to feel like a pattern building towards something worse. Is that always scientifically justified?
Not necessarily, but psychologically, it is completely understandable. The difference between increased risk and immediate doom. This may be the most important distinction in the entire story. A cluster of microquakes can mean increased short-term risk without meaning immediate doom. Those are very different things. USGS's own numbers help make that clear. Around the world, the chance that an earthquake will be followed by a larger nearby earthquake within a week is about 5%. That means the odds are elevated compared with a background expectation, but they still strongly favor no larger event. This is where headlines often go wrong. They translate non-zero probability into something big is probably coming.
That is not what the science says. What the science says is more like this. A cluster matters. It deserves monitoring. The probability of a larger event is somewhat higher than baseline, but most clusters still do not end in a major earthquake. That may sound reassuring, but it is also strangely unsettling, because it means you cannot dismiss the sequence completely. You also cannot treat it like a clear warning. You are left in between. And living in between is exactly what makes earthquake country so mentally exhausting. What scientists watch during a sequence. When a sequence of microquakes appears, scientists are not simply counting events, they are looking for patterns. How tightly are the quakes clustered? Are they migrating along a line? Are magnitudes increasing? Is there one obvious main shock or not? Are they shallow? Are they on a known fault trace? Does the sequence resemble past aftershock patterns, or does it behave more like a classic swarm? USGS's earthquake sequence product exists precisely because these situations require real-time evaluation of changing hazard and probability. The agency notes that swarms are clusters without a clear main shock and that the biggest event can occur later in the sequence. That is why experts do not just look at the event count. 73 tiny quakes, if that number is real for a given window, could mean very different things depending on size, spacing, depth, and location. A sequence of tiny aftershocks after a modest quake is one thing. A migrating swarm on a locked fault segment is another. Same count, very different implications. That is why headline numbers alone rarely tell the real story. The public fear of the big one. Let's be honest, every California earthquake story eventually turns into a story about the big one. Even if the actual sequence is modest, even if the location is not the most dangerous section of the San Andreas, even if scientists are saying the short-term risk remains low. Because the big one is not just a geological concept anymore, it is a cultural one. It represents the moment when all the warnings become real at once. Collapsed infrastructure, fires, broken pipelines, damaged roads, communication failures, and a region suddenly forced to confront the fact that modern life is built on moving ground. That fear is not irrational. California's long-term probabilities remain serious, and the San Andreas, especially in Southern California, remains one of the most watched fault systems in the country. But the hard truth is this: the big one does not need a viral swarm headline to remain dangerous. Its long-term threat exists whether today brings 3 microquakes or 73. And in some ways, that is scarier than any single sequence, because it means the background danger never goes away. So, is a bigger one coming? Here is the most honest answer I can give. I could not verify an official USGS source for the exact claim that the San Andreas Fault recorded 73 microquakes in 12 hours. What I could verify is that California has seen real swarm and aftershock activity recently, that swarms can have their largest event later in the sequence, and that USGS estimates the chance of a larger nearby earthquake within a week at about 5% on average. So, is a bigger one coming? Eventually, yes. California will absolutely experience larger earthquakes again. But can anyone say that this particular burst of tiny quakes means a major earthquake is imminent? No, not responsibly. That is the line between science and sensationalism. Science says, watch, measure, compare, and update probabilities. Sensationalism says, connect every swarm directly to apocalypse. And while that second version is more dramatic, it is not more true. So here is the real takeaway behind the headline. The San Andreas Fault remains one of the most dangerous and most closely watched fault systems in the world. California continues to experience swarms, aftershock sequences, and bursts of smaller quakes that naturally alarm the public. USGS says the short-term chance of a larger nearby earthquake after a quake is about 5% on average, and long-term probabilities for major California earthquakes remain high enough to keep the threat very real. But I could not verify the exact public claim of 73 microquakes in 12 hours as an official standalone San Andreas event. That does not make the fear ridiculous. It makes the situation more subtle. Small quakes are not proof that disaster is hours away. They are also not meaningless. They are reminders. Reminders that the fault is alive, that stress is always shifting, that the ground beneath California is never truly still, and that one day, somewhere along one of these fault systems, a much larger earthquake will arrive. That is not panic. That is geology. The challenge is learning the difference between a sequence that sounds terrifying and a sequence that actually changes the odds in a major way. And on the San Andreas, that difference matters more than almost anywhere else on Earth. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more deep dive scripts on earthquakes, hidden fault activity, geological mysteries, and the real science behind the headlines.